Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind address the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine.
I discovered practical parallel processing, and I did so at 8:15 in the morning of July 4, 1989, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States. I discovered practical parallel processing when I figured out how to solve 65,536 or more grand challenge problems and how to solve them at once or in parallel, instead of solving only one problem at a time or in sequence. My discovery of the parallel supercomputer that was highlighted in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal changed the landscape for extreme-scaled computational physicists and opened new doors for research mathematicians who must think in parallel and do many things at once instead of doing only one thing at a time. The massively parallel supercomputer offers research engineers and research meteorologists the opportunity to solve 1 million or even 1 billion initial boundary value problems at once instead of solving only one such problem at a time. My discovery of practical parallel processing opened the public's imagination on what the computer of tomorrow can do today. 11 years after my discovery of practical parallel processing, my invention of a new supercomputer was reconfirmed by then US President Bill Clinton and reconfirmed in his presidential lecture of August 26, 2000. That lecture of President Bill Clinton was delivered to the Nigerian parliament in Abuja, Nigeria. My contribution to mathematics is this. I discovered that the extreme-scaled computational mathematician of the petroleum industry was seeking the correct solution for his incorrect equation. As supercomputer programmers say, garbage in, garbage out. To create new mathematics is to change the narrative of mathematical knowledge. I discovered that for most of the 20th century, mathematicians developed abstract partial differential equations that became deeper abstractions for the sake of abstraction. I discovered that the mathematicians' dense and complex system of coupled, nonlinear, time-dependent, and three-dimensional and three-phased partial differential equations for the calculus of crude oil, injected water, and natural gas flowing inside a production oil field was incorrectly and incompletely represented by only 3 physical forces, instead of correctly and completely represented by the 4 physical forces that exist within the actual production oil field. That discovery was as unsettling as discovering a drawing of a dog with only 3 legs. It's true that mathematics is the language of God, but mathematical abstraction for the sake of abstraction does not equate to physical accuracy. Therefore, the inertial forces represented by the 36 partial derivative terms of the 9 abstract partial differential equations that I invented must be present in every petroleum reservoir simulation. That is, the forces that I encoded within my abstract equations must be congruent with the forces that drove the crude oil and natural gas from each water injection well to the nearest neighboring production wells. In the early 1980s, I was outraged when I discovered that for a century and a half, mathematicians that claimed to have developed what should otherwise be their most important system of partial differential equations of calculus were de facto contemplating their navels and forgetting that mathematical physics should be a living body of knowledge that ensures that the arithmetic that encodes the algebra, that encodes the laws of calculus, that encodes the laws of physics are always congruent at each level and to each other. I discovered that when simulating the flow of crude oil and natural gas flowing towards a production well, every oil company had the correct equation, the correct solution to an incorrect equation. In my research lecture that I delivered at the 1991 International Congress for Industrial and Applied Mathematics, that was the largest gathering of research mathematicians, I explained that research mathematicians simulating petroleum reservoirs for oil companies were as wrong as having the incorrect solution to the correct equation. As a research mathematician that came of age in the late 1970s and early 1980s, I invented two types of equations. The first is a system of partial differential equations of calculus. The second is an extreme scaled system of partial difference equations of algebra that arose from my finite difference discretization of my partial differential equations. Those two equations are different for the following reasons. The algebraic equates powers of unknown numbers. The differential equates the derivatives of unknown functions. For the past 330 years, calculus was the hottest, the richest, and the most important topic in mathematical research. Perhaps the most important application of algebra is the iconic equation F equals ma, that in turn is the mathematical shorthand for the engineering formula force equals mass times acceleration. F equals ma is the central equation used by the petroleum industry to discover and recover otherwise elusive crude oil and natural gas that is buried 1 mile deep in an oil field the size of Lagos, Nigeria. F equals ma is used to simulate how to drive crude oil and natural gas from water injection wells to oil and gas production wells. The partial differential equation is the most complex equation in mathematical physics and is the most recurring equation in both computational physics and advanced calculus. On the 4th of July, 1989, I discovered how to solve a discretized system of coupled, nonlinear, time-dependent, three-dimensional, three-phased, and state-of-the-art partial differential equations. I discovered how to solve the arising system of equations of algebra and discovered how to solve them across a new internet, that is a new global network of 65,536 commodity off-the-shelf processors that were tightly coupled to each other, that were identical to each other, and that shared nothing between each other. My processors corresponded to 2 raised to power 16 or 65,536 computers. I visualized those computers as equal distances apart. I visualized those computers as on the 15-dimensional hypersurface of a 16-dimensional hyperglobe within a 16-dimensional hyperspace. Mathematics is a living intellectual organism that grows with each research mathematician's contribution to that body of mathematical knowledge. To contribute to computational physics is to change the narrative of how processors are harnessed and used to execute extreme scale models that otherwise will be impossible. My contribution to extreme scale computational physics and advanced calculus is this. I discovered that the petroleum reservoir simulators that were used to recover otherwise elusive crude oil and natural gas encoded only 3 physical forces as their partial derivatives, namely pressure, depressure, viscous, and gravitational forces. Petroleum reservoir simulators should always encode all the 4 physical forces within all oil fields, namely the inertial, pressure, viscous, and gravitational forces. Those petroleum reservoir models that did not encode the temporal and convective inertial forces were nonsensical in the sense that the sum of their 3 forces is not equal to the sum of the 4 forces that drives the crude oil and natural gas out of the production oil fields. Prior to my discovery, the computations within each petroleum reservoir model that was used in the petroleum industry was as nonsensical as a 4-engine aircraft that was flying all the time with only 3 of its 4 engines. The petroleum reservoir models of the 1950s through 70s were nonsensical because the sum of their forces was not equal to the product of their total mass times the acceleration of the crude oil and natural gas that was set in motion and that was flowing from water injection wells to nearby crude oil and natural gas production wells. The petroleum reservoir models of the 1980s was nonsensical because the trillions upon trillions of algebraic equations that represented each petroleum reservoir were de facto erroneously restating that F is not equal to MA, or erroneously restating that force is not equal to mass times acceleration, namely erroneously restating that the second law of motion of physics no longer holds inside production oil fields.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.